steadily it rises. Public preference for Lincoln Continental as the symbol for today's luxury motoring.
Hey, it's Jason ODB, the Lincoln Addict, and this is part 3 of the series where I'm talking about Project Smuggler's Blues, my 64 Lincoln Continental Convertible. In this series, which might end up being 4 episodes, possibly 5, but let's call it 4 or 5 episodes, I'm going to be covering all sorts of things, including what you see at the bottom: air suspension, air management, wheels, tires, and more. What we'll cover in this part 3 is I'll talk a little bit about fittings, relays, airlines, trunk setups, how important that is in terms of a decision on your setup, and then miscellaneous. Before we start, many of you are subscribed, so thank you. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. I also host Lincoln Addict Podcast. You can find some of the newer episodes here, or you want to jump over to Podbean app or Apple Podcasts if you want to go ahead and stream those episodes. So kind of in the overall category of miscellaneous, you have fittings, relays, airlines. One of the most underrated aspects of bagging a car or truck is the small details, right? The small stuff. Airlines and fittings can add up quickly, especially the fittings. I always recommend not cheaping out on fittings, and don't go with the cheap push-to-connect fittings, also known as PTC, push-to-connect. Now, make sure your fittings are DOT approved. That's something that I learned early on. I've been around airbag stuff since the late 90s, and I remember buying, cheap nickel-plated push-to-connect fittings, but they weren't DOT approved, and they tended to leak more. Push-to-connect DOT, in my opinion, is okay, but if you really want to avoid leaks, I've, over the years, have had fantastic luck with compression fittings. So when you run the compression fittings, obviously you're not just pushing the nylon line or whatever line you're running in, you're having to tighten down those compression fittings. But I have found in the late 90s, early 2000s, even mid 2000s, doing that really made sure that my system didn't leak at all. Now, in some tight spaces, in order to get the airline in to the fitting, obviously it is easier if you use a push-to-connect fitting. Many people at the airbag itself use push-to-connect because you're having to put your hand in to potentially however your setup is, and it's not easy to get a wrench in there and tighten it. So I do understand why push-to-connect is used really in some tight spaces. Now let's look at each of these items in detail. Again, fittings, relays, airline, etc. Now, for fittings, if you're doing a system or you're doing this at your own shop or in your garage, you really kind of want to draw out what you need on paper. It really helps. If you're not purchasing a full kit from maybe Devious Customs or some of these other shops where they might already have it all mapped out and bagged and tagged for you, then you're going to have to find somewhere maybe locally to pick up some of these fittings, right? You can obviously go online and order the stuff and it will show up a couple days later, but keep in mind, if you're working like over the weekend doing your setup and you don't have a local place that you could run up to get fittings, then you may find yourself missing a couple of things. That's why it's important, in my opinion, to kind of draw out on paper what you need. You need fittings for your bags, how your airlines are going to tee together, if you're going to have, a gauge. If you're running AccuAir, you're probably not. So, you just have to think about all that stuff. See if you have a local distributor like we do in Tampa, which is Amazon Hose and Fittings, and that's local to us. You can easily... I would remind you can easily spend hundreds of dollars on fittings so you got to plan ahead, make sure that you've got the budget in it. I remember going to Amazon, which, they're not super cheap, and just kind of a normal walk-in purchase and buying a ton of fittings for my 95 Suburban and spending $200-$300. Of course, you're spending more on some of the compression fittings and the DOT fittings, of course. Now, here's an example of one. Let's take a look at Universal Air. And this, again, just as an example, because I'm using Universal Air products on my car. When you go out here, you start to look and say, okay, $10 a fitting, $5, $6, $7, it depends. Here's some of the nickel-plated ones. where this one's obviously NPT on this side and it's push to connect on the other side. Just there's an array of different fittings because you're going to need, depending on your setup, different things. Another thing, which I don't know that they have one here listed. Yes, right here, a union. I highly recommend having, if you're running 3/8 line, have a union in maybe your glove box, or if you have, back in the day, we would put together like a little survival kit for air suspension if we were driving our mini trucks from here to Georgia or here to another state. We're going to be on the road hours and hours. And when you're riding on airbag stuff, hey, more than likely you're not going to have an issue. But in the event that your airline, if it's nylon and it's, you blow a line for some reason, it gets too hot, if it's by the exhaust, whatever, having one of these unions really kind of comes in handy because you can get underneath the vehicle, you could plug in your line on each side, and then boom, you're back in action. But again, when you start looking at these fittings, these prices don't seem too bad, but when you add everything up, depending on your setup, you could easily spend a couple $100. So map that stuff out. You have to determine as well, do you want to run 3/8? I think that's what most people run. Some guys are out there running 1/2 inch. They want quicker setups, but 3/8 I think kind of is overall is the standard. Relays. So Viair does provide 2 small relays which work well. I've always used the Viair, this bigger guy here, the 80 amp relay. And again, I apologize for any typos in here. I kind of put this together kind of quick, but this relay here makes the installation a little bit easier. If you've been around car audio and stereo and stuff, these relays are easy to use, but you got to wire them up. And with this, you just put your power and ground, and then if you have an AccuAir setup, you just kind of tie into these little guys. It's a little bit easier. These used to run about $20. I've seen them $20 to $30. Jimmy used to run this a lot. I think he kind of makes his own setup now. He might just use the smaller relays. I'm not sure, but that's something you have to keep in mind. And again, if you're not used to this stuff, the shop that's installing your setup, they'll obviously be accustomed to those smaller relays. If we look here at this link, again, you'll see there's a couple of different ones, these 40 amps, and then the heavy duty one here. These, I think I've even seen them on Home Depot's website. I mean, these are pretty standard thing, and you can get them from a lot of different places, but again, about $20 to $30. And you got to figure out where you want to mount it. I've seen some people, it's an afterthought, and where it's kind of mounted, it's kind of unsightly. So, you might go, hey, this is a little bit too tall. I don't know. It's maybe 5 or 6 inches tall. If you don't like this, then you could obviously use the normal relays that they give to you. Airline, so nylon line is the most popular and easiest to work with overall. I think majority of systems are nylon, especially underneath the car. Now, hard lines can be aluminum, copper, or stainless. Stainless is a lot more costly and is not as easy to bend, so you got to kind of have a good bender to do it. It's not something that I'm good at doing. Maybe you want to hard line the trunk, right, of your car. You'll see this often. And then they'll have a bulkhead fitting that goes through the metal. And then on the other side, you'll have nylon line all underneath the car. That's a popular setup as well. Or some guys just run entirely nylon. The nylon DOT Airline is very, very good. It's what the tractor trailers run and things like that. And typically you're never going to have an issue as long as you route it right. You don't have it on anything that's going to chafe the line or be too close to exhaust and things like that. Now, you can also go with steel braided Airline under the car, which I did on a 67 that I owned that Jimmy had bagged. It was fantastic. And even though it's a nylon line through the stainless or through the steel braided line, it just helps from like maybe rubbing and things like that. Really, it's just nylon line inside the steel braided on the outside, like kind of what I mentioned. It's not necessary, but an added touch. Now, one aspect of your build that you want to nail down is how intricate you want the trunk setup. Do you want an over-the-top setup that is reliable and works well, or do you want something a little bit above and beyond? So let's take a look at that next. And again, this is just a roll of Airline. Typically, when you're going to buy a kit, some of the kits come with Airline. You want to ask, You're not going to need a huge roll like this, but you are going to need probably 100 feet or so. It sounds like a lot, but you'll see if you're doing your own setup, it goes pretty quick. These are a few setups now. I do apologize in advance. These are all convertible setups. So obviously if you've got a sedan, you got a little bit more to work with, because with a convertible, when the convertible is down, you don't have much space in the trunk. So this is an earlier year Lincoln where the spare tire is up here, and then these are all 64, 65, 66, and 67. So basically you can see here where the top would be down. But these setups you can see are pretty awesome. This one, you can just see the nylon line running here. It looks great. The tank, or the two tanks, are exposed, and then you have the Vire compressors. Here with this guy, Brian, he did a pretty cool setup where everything's a little bit different than you typically see, which I actually like. And you can see here, he's just got the nylon line, and then the steel braided, which comes off of the Vire compressors. Same here with Devious Customs. They did this one where the compressors are running the lines into, I think these are two seamless tanks. The tanks are teed together to give a little bit more space in terms of overall volume of air. And then this is Subline Heights. Again, a couple seamless tanks, it looks like. You've got a little bit of hard line. What I'll tell you is, if you wanted hardline, aluminum is fantastic. It's easier to bend. You can get coils of it, and there's even a tool that will straighten out the aluminum if it comes coiled. So that's kind of cool. But this setup here is typically what you're going to see in convertibles and sedans. You're basically going to have the compressors down here in this wheel well where the spare tire would typically go. And then you're going to have your tanks. It all mounts down in there very nicely. Again, you can see a clear image here of a 66, 67. And again, the earlier ones, the 1s, 2s, and 3s, they're going to have a setup more like this because the trunk was a little bit different. In these examples, you'll see, again, for convertibles, what's the common thing here? Vire compressors and dual tanks. Often people will tell you that you have to have two tanks on these cars. And I know Jeff at Devious even has said, hey, you can get by with one, but it is better to have two. I'm curious to see how my setup's going to work with the one tank. Down the road, I can always add another tank and kind of tee in like they did here. So miscellaneous, as we start to wrap this up, transmission crossmember. I didn't talk about this. You can get this from Devious, and this transmission crossmember just makes for your car to be able to lay flat a little bit more, because the factory bolts that come down would hold the car up depending on how low your car is. So this crossmember is really nice. Tony and I actually installed this when we were installing the transmission. That way it was done, and then when Jimmy was dealing with the air suspension, he didn't have to worry about it. A thread sealant, so Loctite. This is what people swear by, and if we look back here, it's the Loctite 565, and this is the sealant for your air fittings. So I've heard people talk about this. I used to use nylon, or I'm drawing a blank, the nylon line that goes around it. But this stuff, you just put like a little dab of it on each of the fittings before you thread them in, and that'll help get rid of any of the leaks. So thread sealant, power cable from the front to the back of the car. So what I had ordered whenever I was getting my parts together, I went on Amazon for $92, is probably about $100 then, 25 feet of a real good, what they'll call a flexible welding cable. And this is kind of a real high-end power cable, a little bit better than you might find at your local stereo shop. And I ran that all the way to the back. That way I'll be able to have solid power for my compressors, my AccuAir ECU, and things like that. So it takes a little bit of time. Spend your time routing that out. Water traps, which are also referred to as air filters. These were two that I had purchased. Again, just kind of keeping the theme with universal air. These actually look really nice as well. Depending on where you live and depending on who you talk to, they'll say, you don't need to run any air filters or whatnot. Here, I have seen in Florida, people empty their tanks and have a good bit of moisture in it, basically water. So What you want to avoid is when the air is coming out of your tank and going into your manifold, which in my case is a VU4, you don't want all of that moisture getting in there, right? Over the course of time, it can cause valves, the air valves, which is the manifold, to stick and things like that. It's just best case scenario if you can run a water trap. And some people swear by them. Some people go, I've had bag stuff for 20 years. I've never worried about it. But here in Florida, I know a couple guys that have setups where they end up with a lot of water in the tank. Use Loctite where applicable on key suspension components. So I reinforce this. Whoever's installing your stuff, if they're a professional, they're going to more than likely know they got to use some Loctite here and there on different bolts and things like that. That's so that things don't back out over the course of time in terms of your general suspension, right? Not your air fitting, so to speak. But you can always double check that stuff, and we'll talk more about that in the next video. Exhaust, don't forget, your factory exhaust on these Lincolns is not going to work if your car is sitting on the ground. You can check with Devious Customs to see what they offer, or have a local shop custom make your exhaust once the car's bagged or during the install. No one wants to drive a super nice Lincoln with a crappy sounding exhaust with no muffler. So that's something that's underrated. You can go with stainless, you can go with regular steel, but you're going to have to do it. So, keep that in mind in terms of your overall budget. With that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. This was a little bit shorter video talking about my 64 Lincoln Continental Smugglers Blues. Check out Lincoln Addict Podcast, however you find podcasts, and have a great day. Thank you for the support. We out of here. Peace.